So now the last and most famous analogy, the analogy of the cave. And I got this cool and quite accurate picture that a student of a friend of mine made. So you're not subjected to my drawings. This is the one real benefit of not having in-person class. I can just show you a much better picture. So what's going on here? Well, I think for the cave, we want to go step by step. So you're starting out, if you look at the picture, you've got that kind of rock that's sticking up the platform, and then there are the people you can dimly see sitting in front of it. And though that's the initial position, Socrates says, the humans living in an underground cave-like dwelling who've been there since childhood with their necks and legs fettered, so they're fixed in the same place, able to see only in front of them. So not only can these people not move around, we also can't even turn our heads when we're in this situation. You have to look in front of you. And what do you see in front of you? Well, you're looking at the wall of the cave. And what you're seeing is what these people alongside the wall are carrying. They're carrying multifarious artifacts that project above it. Statues of people and other animals made of stone, wood, and every material. And as you would expect, some of the carriers are talking and some are silent. So in the picture we have here, someone's carrying a statue of a dog. But note that what the prisoners are seeing isn't the statue of the dog itself. They're seeing the shadow on the wall from the reflection of the dog produced by this fire that's in the back of the cave. So the light from the fire goes forward. The puppets held up above the this projection here cast shadows, and then those shadows are what we see. So note that here we've got the two levels of the visible world we saw before in the analogy of the sun and divided line are present, but they're kind of reconfigured here in the cave. Because here, in the analogy of the sun, it looked like, and divided line, it looked like Plato was initially just talking about sometimes we see the tree, sometimes we see the shadow of the tree. But here, the examples have changed. The examples he gives are that artifacts are being carried in front of people. And what we're seeing are not the artifacts, but their shadows. So I think what Plato wants us to think about here are what would these shadows and reflections be that we're exposed to from childhood? If he's not talking about literal reflections in water, why does he describe everything these prisoners see in their childhood and in society from an early age as reflections? So anyone want to take a stab at that? In what sense these things on the wall, what are these shadows that we're seeing, and where do they come from? Who are the puppet masters that are carrying these puppets? Be deceptive. I think here it's important that these aren't presented as natural reflections, but reflections that are carried by people. So Kelsey asks about what the significance are. And I think there it's helpful to think back to the critique of the poets in books 2 and 3. That think in the ancient Greek world, well, what is a man? What is it to be a man? What does virtue look like? Where do you find the answer? Well, the answer for most ancient Greeks is you look to Homer. You look to what are Achilles and Agamemnon like. So the idea is when we grow up in society, I don't have direct access to what it is to be a man and manly and courageous and virtuous. Instead, what I get is various images or representations, these appearances and shadows and artifacts from my culture. And in the ancient Greek context, that means I look to Achilles and how his demands for honor and status and his wrath when he isn't given that. But then that's why Plato's so bothered when Achilles says he's afraid of death. Well, he overcomes death because he really does love honor, but then his shade is miserable and says, I'd rather be back on Earth. I kind of regret my choice now, when Odysseus talks to him in the Odyssey. That really bothers Plato, because the idea is, for most of us, our conceptions of what it is to be human, what it is to be a man or a woman, what it is to live a good life, what kind of pets you should have, why we raise cats and dogs instead of iguanas and buzzards or whatever. That's all coming from society. So I don't have that kind of independent access. Instead, I think, like, I get all these messages. I think ads are a great instance of this, where I find out what kind of deodorant will make me smell manly and attractive, what kind of clothing or cars will showcase the kind of status I want. And if you look at ads, they're always presenting sort of the ideal versions of themselves for the consumers they're targeting. So some are more aimed at parents or people at different stages of life, but whatever it is, they're presenting a kind of ideal appearance that you're then supposed to be attracted to.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. It's like, if people are creating the shadows, it mirrors kind of the way the political system is set.
Yeah, so culture, it would definitely also cover political institutions for Plato. And then Kelsey asks about whether the puppet masters are sort of consciously puppet masters, and they sort of know what's really going on. I'm not sure if that's clear in the analogy, because I think the focus is on the perception of the people who are chained up. On the analogy, it kind of seems like they'd be aware of what they're doing. But I could also imagine someone being a puppet master in one respect, say, maybe I am an athlete or creating ads or something, but that doesn't mean I'm not in other areas of my life subject to these same images and appearances. So I think it's best to think of us all in the cave, but sort of some of the prisoners take it in turns to be the puppet masters. Though that's maybe at least the interpretation I'm doing, that makes that part of it a little imperfect. But of course, no analogy is going to be completely perfect. Go back to this example we used a lot. Think about beauty. So, what's beautiful? Well, that's what you get all these advertisements of and pictures in magazines and video and everything else, that we get a certain views of from our culture. And one way to see the difference is, to look at other cultures that also have their own messages. And now maybe there's more connections between cultures in our current age. But that's one way to see. If you go to different societies and you see them be putting different images forward of what's beautiful and what's just, you're going to notice those discrepancies. If you were exposed to many cultures in a way that you might not if you're just in your own culture and seeing those shadows on the wall. Where you assume the words you use apply to the things you see passing in front of them, even though you're just talking about shadows of artifacts. And it's interesting on this analogy. We all would like to think everyone else is in the cave and we're the ones who've gotten out. But it's interesting the way the analogy develops. Although the person gets out of the cave, it's all put in passive language. When someone was freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his neck around, walk, and look up toward the light, he would be pained by doing all these things and be unable to see the things whose shadows he'd seen before because of the flashing lights.
Unknown participant is now exiting.
If we told him he's a bit closer to what is, he'd be puzzled. So another thing to note about this analogy is it's not that there's a natural and easy transition from looking at shadows to getting out of the cave. The story we're given in the analogy is literally of someone who's the shackles are forcibly taken off and turned around, and there is an indication that this is something that would we'd get out of automatically. So this is presented as a stable setup, unless you are compelled by someone like Socrates to really look away from the images your society is giving you and turn to the forms. And then if you were dragged by force away from there, the person would be pained and angry. This would be a painful process, discarding some of these images and realizing they aren't the real thing. And then when you got out of the cave, you'd be blinded by the light. You definitely wouldn't be able to see the sun, and you'd even have trouble seeing the visible things around. So in our diagram, we've got this person who's just gotten out, and they're looking, but it's going to be hard for them to see. 516a, that person would need time to get adjusted. At first, he'd see shadows most easily, then images of men and other things in water, then the things themselves. From these, it would be easier for him to go on to look at the things in the sky and the sky itself at night, gazing at the light of the stars and the moon, then during the day, gazing at the sun and the light of the sun. And finally, he'd be able to see the sun, not reflections of it in water or some alien place, but the sun just by itself in its own place, and be able to look at it and see what it's like. So that's where, even when you turn away from appearances and start moving to using your mind and reason and the intelligible, you still can't get right away up to the good. You've got to slowly get accustomed to the light and brilliance of the intelligible, and it's only after a long period that you can go up and look at the sun itself. So there was a question about what the significance is, Parker was asking, of the statues and being artifacts as opposed to capturing a puppy or something else and actually bringing it down into the cave. I think that's supposed to make clear how limited our perspective is in the cave, that you can't even bring the real things down there. What you can do is make artifacts and copies of the real things, and then what we have access to through art and culture are these representations of things that aren't themselves. So the real. So the idea is even the visible things, even a dog or a human or all these other things, they're still only imperfect representations of the forms. Whereas bringing a living dog down in the analogy of the cave would be something like bringing one of the forms themselves down into the visible world. But that's just not going to be possible. The cave is the limits of the cave sort of because it requires that you no longer think about things through reason, but only through what's accessible to perception and our senses. That's just such a limitation that you can't bring a living real form down there. You can only bring this artifact or imitation. And in fact, that's going to be Plato's critique, which we're not going to read over, but he comes back to a critique of the poets in Book 10 that critiques them for producing an imitation of an imitation, that the things in the visible world are imitations of the forms, and then in art, you add another level onto that of imitation onto that, so you're getting further and further away. So now, a lot of human concepts and use of language, Coleman was asking about. I mean, I think Plato agrees that most of the way we use language would be would reflect the kind of limitations of our perspective. But there is this idea that if we train properly and use our mind, we will be able to get to an understanding and grasp of the forms themselves that transcends language and is more perfect. So how we do that and how we deal with the sophist is very worried about negative terms, that how could we even distinguish being from not being and know non-being, and can we know changing things? There are a lot of difficulties, but at least the hope and the picture here is ascending up. But what we don't really get is exactly how this would happens. Other than Socrates says, you could be chosen by a god like him, or influenced by Socrates. But I think it's worth noting that this isn't presented as a sudden flash of insight you have. So we do the analogy of the cave, and I didn't make you read the rest of book 7. But there, Plato actually finishes setting out the education program that will enable the guardians in the ideal city to achieve the form of the good. And it's not just sort of sitting around or like meditating for half an hour and then achieving complete insight. Instead, it's doing math, a lot of math. So, in fact, for those of you who don't like math, you can really blame Plato, because the rest of book 7 is an explanation of why the guardians are going to need to know both arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, though astronomy that isn't even about the visible, but ultimately sort of a theory of things. They do that, then they get some experience in governing, and then they get training in, well, helping out in governing. They're not fully governing. Then they get training in dialectic, and so it's only after decades of training in math and dialectic in the hierarchs that, if all goes well in the perfect city, you see the form of the good when you're 50. So that's only if you've been brought up right for your first 20 years and then got this 30 years of further education and training. So it's not as if Plato's thinking this will be easier. You just walk out of the cave. But he does set this education system up that then inspires the liberal arts and the prominent role he gives to mathematics in bringing the link between the perceptible and the intelligible, then sets us up for thousands of years of math education. So you can thank Plato for that, or blame him. And then it's those who have seen the form of the good at 50 who can then go back into the cave. And they're never going to be perfect in the cave either, just because of the limitations of the cave. They can't fully bring back the forms, and in fact, they're going to need some time to get adjusted to the shadows. They might not be as quick at picking up the images at first, and this is where we go back to the ship of state idea, that the philosopher is going to look kind of useless, but once their eyes get accustomed, because they have that perspective, because they've seen what things are really like, and they've seen the sun, then they will end up being better. And they go back not because they want to. I mean, who would want to go back into the cave after you've seen the sun? But for the right kind of reasons that we talked about back in book 1, to avoid paying the penalty of being ruled by someone worse. So, although at first they'll behave awkwardly and appear completely ridiculous, that's because they've got to get reaccustomed to the darkness before they can help out with our institutions. And then they will be able to do so, and they'll be willing to do so for the common good, for the good of the whole. 520c, for when you're used to it, you'll see infinitely better than the people there and know precisely what each image is and also what it is an image of, because you've seen the truth about fine, just, and good things. And then we'll have a city that will be await, governed by us and by you, not dreaming like the majority of cities nowadays. So they're not going to want to rule, but they're going to be willing to do so to avoid that penalty and to make for a good city. And then we also get one positive note. So I've emphasized how difficult and challenging it will be, but we come back to a theme I mentioned in the Meno about education and knowledge, that knowledge isn't putting that education isn't putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes, he says at 518c. But the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and the instrument with which each of us learns is present. Just as an eye cannot be turned around from darkness to light except by turning the whole body, so this instrument, our understanding, must be turned around from what comes to be together with the whole soul until it's able to bear to look at what is and at the brightest thing that is, the one that's called the good. So on one way it's really hard, but on the other way, Plato's saying we actually all have this tool and this ability within, this amazing power of reason and understanding, that if we turn it correctly, and we need lots of help from society and education and everything else, there is this capacity within everyone to see the good and understand things. So that's the more optimistic message you can take away. Okay, so we've got our analogies, and as I said, that then sets up the program of education for the ideal city, and actually very influential in reality as we know it as well. This question, has Plato answered what is good, or just how do you come to know what's good for a city or individual? And I think that's a fair question. And I think that goes back to what Socrates' initial disclaimer is, that he hasn't actually offered us a theory of the good. Instead, he's offered these analogies for how you get up there. But he sort of can't tell us, because none of us, well, a lot of us aren't even 50, but even those who are 50 probably haven't had the perfect education. So we don't actually get an answer to what the good is. And Plato doesn't give one in any of his dialogues, though Aristotle refers to some things that he said in the Academy about goodness being connected to unity. That's why the later Platonists called the good the one. So we don't get a theory, but instead we get an explanation that if you do study the forms and then get up to the good, these philosophers really would have the knowledge they needed. But I can't share it with you because I don't have it, because I'm not a true philosopher. But if I had gone through this program, well, then I could probably still only share it with you if you'd gone through it too. But we have the right kind of eyes and abilities. So maybe if this class continues for the next 20 years, we'll get there. So how do you know if you can get out of the cave? And is Plato claiming he is out? I mean, I think one sign is how captive you are to the images of your society. I think on the one hand, I think, yeah, Plato be suspicious of a lot of his readers. It's easy to think that other people were in the cave, but I'm not. So thinking you're out of the cave isn't necessarily a good sign for actually being out of the cave. I think that's right. I think someone like Socrates, who just we see both in words and in deeds, is so separated and really living by his understanding of what's good. That's a kind of sign. But I'm not sure we should even, especially if you read Plato as more setting out a research program than claiming he's achieved it. Maybe even Plato isn't necessarily claiming to be fully out of the cave. We'll see. I mean, that's one of the tricky things about dialogue form, and knowing how much to take this as Plato's considered view versus a view that he's examining, but maybe isn't fully committed to. And we get to Aristotle. Aristotle is pretty confident he's out of the cave and he's seen the form. Well, he's got to qualify some of the stuff Plato says about forms. He's got his own view, but Aristotle was a confident dude. So I'm not sure about Plato.